The night I found out, it was raining. Not a dramatic storm. Just that quiet, steady Ohio rain that streaks the windows and makes everything outside look like it's dissolving. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, scrolling through my phone without actually reading anything. My grandmother was 3 floors above me in the cardiac ICU. The doctors had told us that morning that she needed a valve replacement. Not optional. Not let's monitor it. Her heart was failing. And without the surgery, she had maybe 8 weeks. 8 weeks. I kept turning that number over in my head like a stone. 8 weeks. My grandmother raised me. My parents were in the picture, technically, but they were the kind of parents who were always just about to get their lives together. My dad had a landscaping business that went under when I was 6, then a bar that never quite opened, then a series of opportunities that required startup money and returned nothing. My mom worked the front desk at a tanning salon and spent most of her evenings on the phone with her sister, my Aunt Vera, talking about everyone else's problems. My grandmother was the one who packed my lunch, drove me to school, sat in the bleachers at my volleyball games in the freezing cold. She was the one who called me on Sunday mornings and asked about my week like she actually wanted to know. When I was 22, I got a job offer in Columbus, entry-level HR coordinator at a logistics company. Nothing glamorous, but it was stable. My grandmother cried when I told her. Happy tears, she said. She pressed $300 into my hand even though I told her not to. That's what grandmothers do, she said. I worked hard. I lived cheap. I had a studio apartment for 4 years where the radiator knocked all winter and the parking lot light was always flickering, and I didn't care because I was saving. Not because I had some grand plan, just because I didn't want to end up like my dad. Always one bad month from disaster. I picked up payroll certification, moved into a senior HR role, switched companies twice for better salaries. By the time I was 31, I had built up $847,000 in savings, a brokerage account, and a small IRA. It sounds like a lot. It took 9 years of packed lunches, no vacations, and one very used Honda. When the cardiologist told us about the surgery, I didn't hesitate. I went home that night, sat at my kitchen table, and started researching cardiac surgery costs, insurance coverage gaps, post-op rehabilitation. My grandmother's Medicare covered a portion. The gap was significant. I had the money. That was the end of the conversation in my head. She had given me everything. I could give her this. I didn't announce it to the family. I just called the hospital financial coordinator the next morning and asked to set up a meeting. That's where everything started to fall apart. My parents found out 3 days later. I don't know exactly how. Probably my cousin Bree, who has never kept a secret in her life and has been my mother's informant since we were children. All I know is that I was walking out of the hospital after visiting hours and my phone rang. It was my dad. He opened with, "Why didn't you tell us?" which I thought was about my grandmother's condition. And then very quickly I realized it was about the money. "Your mother and I have been going through a rough patch," she said. "You know the situation with the back taxes. The IRS is not playing around. We need access to some liquidity." I stopped walking. I was standing in the hospital parking garage, and the fluorescent lights were buzzing, and I just stood there. "Dad," I said, that money is for Grandma's surgery. I know that. I'm not saying take it all. I'm saying family helps family. We raised you." He said it so easily, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. I told him I had to go. I hung up and sat in my car for 15 minutes before I could drive. Over the next week, my parents came to the hospital every day. They had never been particularly devoted grandchildren. My grandmother had a complicated relationship with my dad, who was her son-in-law, not her blood. And my mother had always been vaguely resentful of how close we were. But suddenly they were there every afternoon, bringing flowers, chatting up the nurses, positioning themselves in the room like they belonged. My grandmother was exhausted and medicated and happy to see people. She didn't notice the tension. I did. My Aunt Vera flew in from Phoenix. She's my mother's older sister, and she has always had my mother's ear in a way I've never fully understood. The two of them together have a particular energy. Not hostile exactly, but watchful. Calculating. Like they're always running a tab. On a Thursday evening, I was in the hallway outside my grandmother's room, on the phone with the hospital financial office confirming the payment schedule, when my mother came out and stood next to me. She waited until I hung up. "We need to have a family conversation," she said, "about the money, about what's fair." "What's fair is that Grandma gets her surgery paid for," I said. "Nobody's arguing that." She folded her arms. "But you have almost $1 million sitting there, and your father and I are being audited. Vera is about to lose her house. You're single, no kids. What exactly do you need all that for?" I looked at her. I thought about all the Sunday phone calls, all the volleyball bleachers, all the pressed $100 bills. "It's not a family fund," I said. "I saved it." She gave me a look I remembered from childhood. The one that meant you were being selfish and you should feel bad about it, and went back into the room. I should have moved the money that night. I know that now. I have replayed it so many times. I should have called my bank the moment I got home and restructured everything, but I was tired and I genuinely thought that they understood, that they were upset and venting, and that eventually the reality of the situation would land. I was wrong. I found out on a Monday. I'd gone to the hospital first thing in the morning because my grandmother had had a restless night and I wanted to check on her before work. She was asleep when I arrived. I sat next to her bed for a while and then stepped out to call my bank and confirm the next transfer to the hospital. The balance was $214,000. I asked the representative to repeat it. She did. $214,000. I had started the week with $847,000. I stood in the hallway outside my grandmother's room with the phone pressed to my ear and asked the representative to tell me what had happened. She told me that a series of wire transfers had been initiated over the previous 4 days. They were authorized. The account had a joint holder. My mother. When I was 22 and moving to Columbus, she had asked to be added to my account. In case of emergency, she said. "You're young, you're moving to a new city, if something happens to you," and I had said yes because I was 22 and she was my mother, and it didn't occur to me that this was something other than what she said it was. The authorization had been sitting there for 9 years. I don't remember walking out of the hospital. I have a fragmented memory of the parking garage, of sitting in my car, of my hands on the steering wheel. The next thing I clearly remember is being at my parents' house. I don't know if I called first. I don't think I did. My dad answered the door. He looked at my face and stepped back. My mother was in the kitchen. Aunt Vera was there too, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee, like she lived there. The three of them looked at me like they had been expecting me. "Where is it?" I said. "All of it." "Where did it go?" My dad started talking about the IRS debt, the back taxes, the penalties, Aunt Vera's mortgage, how the money could be paid back once things settled down, how I was young and had earning potential, how this was a loan, not a theft. "Grandma needs $620,000 for that surgery," I said. "You have left $214,000 in that account. You took the rest." My mother looked me in the eyes and said, "She's 83, sweetheart. You have to be realistic about what you're spending this for." The kitchen was very quiet. "She raised me," I said. "We raised you," my mother said. I have thought about that exchange many times in the months since. The casual certainty of it, the complete absence of shame. I left without another word. I sat in my car in their driveway and called my bank and revoked every authorization on the account. Then I called a lawyer. His name was Mr. Ashworth, a civil attorney in Columbus who handled financial fraud and elder abuse cases. I found him through a referral from a coworker who had dealt with something similar after her father's death. He had an office above a dry cleaner on High Street and a manner that was very calm and very precise, which is exactly what I needed at that moment. He listened to everything I said without interrupting. Then he asked me several questions. The date the joint authorization was added, whether I had any documentation of what it was originally for, whether the transfers were clearly traceable to my parents' accounts, whether my grandmother had ever been listed on any of the financial instruments involved. "The good news," he said, "is that this is not complicated. The transfers are documented. The funds are traceable. What they did is called unauthorized financial exploitation of a family member, and in Ohio, it carries both civil and criminal liability. The elder abuse angle adds weight because the funds were explicitly designated for your grandmother's care. Explicitly? I said. I didn't put anything in writing. Did you tell anyone else? Hospital staff? The financial coordinator? I had. I had said it in email in the payment planning meeting to the cardiologist's office coordinator. All documented. Mr. Ashworth nodded slowly. That helps. The hardest part wasn't the legal process. The legal process was something I could move through. It had steps. Mr. Ashworth made calls, filed papers, issued a demand for the return of funds. My parents' attorney, my dad had an attorney, it turned out, which somehow surprised me, responded within a week claiming the transfers were a mutual family agreement. The hardest part was my grandmother. She didn't know any of it. She was recovering from a preliminary procedure, waiting on surgical clearance, taking medication that made her foggy and tired. Every time I walked into her hospital room, I had to arrange my face so that she didn't see what was happening. She would ask me if everything was okay, and I would say yes, and she would squeeze my hand with her thin fingers and tell me not to worry so much. You've always been my worrier, she said, since you were little. You used to check the stove 3 times before bed. I still do, I said. She laughed. It was a small sound, but it was real, and I held on to it. Mr. Ashworth moved quickly. He filed for a temporary restraining order to freeze my parents' accounts pending investigation. He also contacted the hospital and explained the situation to the financial coordinator, who was, to her enormous credit, immediately helpful. She connected us with the hospital's patient advocacy office, which had a fund for exactly these kinds of situations. Cases where elderly patients' treatment funds had been compromised. The fund wouldn't cover everything, but it would cover enough to proceed with surgery scheduling while the legal case moved forward. My grandmother went into surgery on a Tuesday morning in November. I sat in the surgical waiting room for 6 hours. There was a woman across from me doing a crossword puzzle in pen. There was a man in a Bengals cap who fell asleep in his chair and snored quietly. A child ran back and forth in front of the windows until her mother caught her. Normal life happening all around me, while my grandmother's chest was open and her heart was in someone else's hands. At 3:47 in the afternoon, her surgeon came through the doors and said it had gone well. I started crying before she finished the sentence. The legal resolution took 4 months. My parents did not go to prison. This is the part I know people want to hear about, and I want to be honest. What happened was this. My father's back tax situation had already attracted IRS attention independently, and the addition of a civil fraud case made his attorney advise him strongly toward a settlement. They returned $580,000. The remaining portion, funds that had already been spent on the tax debt, not Vera's mortgage, was structured as a judgment, meaning I would be repaid from any future assets. My Aunt Vera, to my knowledge, has not spoken to my mother since. I don't know what passed between them. I don't ask. My mother sent me a text message in March, 7 months after the surgery, asking if we could talk. I have not responded. My grandmother came home in December. She spent 2 months doing cardiac rehab at an outpatient center 20 minutes from her house. I drove her twice a week. We listened to oldie stations on the way there and true crime podcasts on the way back. Her choice, both ways. She likes the ones where the perpetrators get caught. One morning in February, we were sitting in her kitchen after I'd made us bold coffee, and she was telling me about her neighbor's new dog, and she stopped mid-sentence and looked at me. You know, she said. I know something happened with your parents. You don't have to tell me what. I looked at my coffee cup. You got through it, she said. That's what I see. Whatever it was, you got through it. I didn't say anything. She reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over mine. And I thought about the $300 she had pressed into my palm 9 years ago, and the volleyball bleachers, and the Sunday morning phone calls. I'm still here, she said. I know, I said. The dog across the street started barking at something. A truck went by. The coffee was getting cold. I know, I said again. People ask me sometimes, friends, co-workers, my therapist, whether I'm angry, and the honest answer is that I was for a long time. I am still, sometimes in specific moments. when I see a certain expression on my mother's face in an old photograph, when I'm doing something for my grandmother and I think about how close it came to not happening. But mostly what I feel now is something quieter than anger, a kind of clarity about what family means and what it doesn't, about the difference between people who show up and people who show up only when there's something to take, about the fact that the most important relationship of my life, the one that shaped me, that taught me how to be a person, was with a woman who showed up for me every single time without ever asking for anything back. I still drive her to cardiac rehab. The appointments are monthly now instead of weekly. Last week, she told the receptionist that I was her granddaughter and also her best friend, in that order. And the receptionist said, "That's sweet," in a distracted way, already looking at her computer. But I heard it. I will always have heard it. I've spent a lot of time since then trying to figure out when it all went wrong. Not the obvious moment, not the wire transfers, not my mother's face in that kitchen. I mean before that, the moment the conditions were created for any of it to be possible. And I keep coming back to the same answer. I trusted people with access they hadn't earned, because I believed that love was a kind of proof, that if someone loved you, they couldn't also be capable of that. Well, my family taught me, the hard way, the expensive way, the kind of way that changes how you sleep at night, is that love and integrity are not the same thing. A person can genuinely believe they love you and still take from you without blinking. The two things can exist in the same person at the same time. That's not a contradiction. That's just something nobody tells you when you're young. What I did right, and I've had to give myself credit for this, because my therapist keeps telling me I don't, was that I kept moving. When I found out the money was gone, I didn't collapse. I didn't beg. I didn't wait for my parents to fix what they had broken. I called Mr. Ashworth and I let the process work. And I showed up every day for my grandmother in that hospital even when it cost me something I didn't have left to give. That is not a small thing. That is actually the whole thing. My grandmother didn't know the specifics until much later. When I finally told her, sitting at her kitchen table, spring light coming through the curtains, her cardiac rehab folder on the counter, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry you had to carry that alone." Not, "I can't believe they did that." Not anger, not shock, just, "I'm sorry you carried it alone." That's who she is. That's who she has always been. There's a version of this story where I never find out until it's too late, where my grandmother doesn't get surgery, where I spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd checked the account one day sooner, or moved the money before they could reach it, or never added that authorization in the first place. I think about that version sometimes. It's close enough to real that it doesn't feel like a hypothetical. What I know now is this. The people who show up quietly, without an audience, without keeping score, those are the people worth protecting. And protecting them sometimes means protecting yourself first. It means being clear-eyed about who has access to what, even when that clarity feels like a betrayal of trust, even when it's uncomfortable to think about. Being naive about the people closest to you isn't loyalty. It's just a risk you're taking without knowing it. Bree never apologized. My Aunt Vera went quiet. My mother's text is still unanswered in my phone, sitting there like a stone. But my grandmother is alive. She's doing her crossword puzzles in pen. She beats me at gin rummy twice a week. Last month, she bought herself a new hummingbird feeder for the back porch and called me to tell me it was working. That's what I got to keep. That's what I fought for. I don't need anything else to make sense of it.